Welcome back to another Spirit Island video. In this video, we will be covering an overview of Scotland. Now, if this is an adversary that you are struggling with, I highly suggest watching the entire video. We'll be talking about some board strategies, minors, majors, and just general tips for the adversary. So, let's look at Scotland and what does it do. Now, Scotland is primarily a coastal adversary. It's going to pressure those coastal lands and then also the ocean. And the way it's going to do that is first with this loss condition. And that says that if the number of coastal lands with cities is ever greater than 2 times the number of boards, the invaders win. So what does that mean? That means in a one-player game, it has to exceed 2 times the number of boards. So that means if all 3 of your coastal lands in a one-player game have cities, the players lose. Now, if we're playing, in this case, a 6-player game, assuming these 6 boards, now we would multiply that by 6. So in which case, so it'd be 2 times 6, so it'd be 12 coastal lands. So now if I look on this board, currently we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 lands with cities. We can go up to 12. And to show what that would look like, that would be every board having at least 2 cities. Now, if we go over that 12, that means if one of these boards has 3 lands with cities, then we lose, assuming you've hit that max. Now, if one board goes to 3 coastal lands with cities, but let's say board F and A don't, you'd count, you'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So we're at 11 out of the 12, and that's how that loss condition works. Looking at the escalation, it says on the single board with the most coastal buildings, add 1 tower to the N land with the fewest towns, where N is the number of players. Now, this escalation is really interesting because normally escalations affect all players equally. Versus Scotland, it's going to affect 1 player a lot. And it's actually really cool because it forces the other players at the board to help that player out. So in this 6-player game, when escalations hit, if I'm on board B, I have to select the 6 N lands with the fewest towns, in which case all of these lands are tied, and then I have to add 6 towns. So in this case, I'd throw 1 on D2, and you would have to set them up. So in this case, I added 5, 6. And then that would be adding the 6 towns. Now, you can never add 2 towns to the same land with this escalation. So if your board, let's say, looked like this to start off with, and I have to now add 6 towns, I would have to first add a town into my sands here on B3, and then I have to add 5 towns distributed amongst the rest of my lands. I can't add a second land to my B3 even though it's tied again. So you can never choose a land twice once you're escalating. And as I already mentioned, it forces the team to kind of support that individual. Now, there are some spirits in the game that I call tanks, and those are spirits that can take all of the escalations and receive minimal support and perform well. And we'll talk about that later in the video. Okay, looking at the level 1, it says after setup, in coastal lands, explore cards add towns instead of explorers. The coastal lands invader card does this a maximum of 2 lands per board. So we have 2 things. First, it says after setup. That means it's the very first explore that occurs. There's no towns for the explorer because this is the setup explorer. So on board B, it would explore like normal. Now, the second stage 1 is wetlands. So in this case, now I'll be exploring towns on the coast. And as you can see, when you explore towns on the coast, that is going to pressure the amount of coastal cities that you're building, which will pressure this loss condition. Now it says coastal lands invader card does this do this maximum two lands per board. So when the coast card comes up, you're going to pick 2 of those 3 lands, and that's when you're going to add towns. The other one you'll add an explorer, and you can pick and choose. Now, if you have a wilds in one of the lands, you're forced to add towns to the other lands. The same goes if you isolated one of the lands. You're forced to add towns to the lands that you can do that. So you're not allowed to use the wilds or use the isolate to dodge to eat one of the town explorers and then have an explorer exploring one of the other lands. Now it says only for the coast card. That means if you have a stage 3, trying to find it, like jungle wetlands, whoever has the jungle wetlands board on board D, they're going to get 3 towns because it's only specifying the coastal land card. This is a little mistake that a lot of players make. They'll be playing board D, the stage 3 will come up, and they'll think it maximizes at 2 lands per boards, but it actually does not because it's saying only the coastal lands card. Okay. Looking at level 2, we're going to be adding a city into land 2. So now your land 2 is going to have 2 cities. And then you're going to set up the invader deck such that there are 2 stage 1s, 2 stage 2s, a stage 1, a coast, a stage 2, and then a 5 stage 3s. So we have this guaranteed coast card on turn, turn 5, I guess, or turn 6. And I have that shown over here. So we have our 2 stage 1s, 2 stage 2s with escalations. We have another stage 1, and we know it can't be these 2 land types. So if I'm playing against a lower level Scotland, I'm planning for this card. I then know when coast comes up, that's turn 6, it looks like. You have 1 more escalation. Once again, we already have 2 of the stage 2s. So I'm kind of planning essentially these 3 turns. I'm planning out my actions with this knowledge of it's a 50-50, it's a 50-50, and then I know 100% what the card is. So this is what Scotland level 2 does. Scotland level 3, it says in coastal lands, build cards affect lands without invaders so long as there is an adjacent city. Now it just says adjacent city. That means if it's a coastal city or an inland city, all you have to do is check, is there a city adjacent? If yes, you build in the coastal land. And that's going to affect control-based strategies. If you're a spirit, like Shadows, for instance, and I disrupt the Explorer here on B3, they're still going to build in B3 because it's adjacent to a city here on B2. Defensive strategies tend to be more favorable against this adversary because, like I said, you're always going to be building in these coastal lands. Well, most likely you will be. And it's easier to defend the land than to push everything out because of that Scotland 3 rule. Level 4. This is an additional setup change to the deck. Instead of that stage 1 before the coast, it's now a stage 3. And I've indicated that over here, where instead of that stage 1, it's a stage 3. And this is actually a massive increase in difficulty. You'd think it'd be minor, but it's really not, just because it's doubling the amount of lands, and it's also going to choose lands that it's a wild card. You don't know what lands are coming up, while this stage 1 you have a 50% chance of guessing correctly. So it could be pretty devastating. Another thing is there are cases where there's a high likelihood that the stage 2 in front of the stage 3 here lines up with the stage 3. Oh, good. It lines up perfectly here. And this can be problematic. I'll explain that in a second why. Scotland level 5, it says after a Ravage action adds Blight to a coastal land, add 1 Blight to that board's ocean without cascading. Treat the ocean as a coastal wetland for this rule and for Blight removal and movement. So level 5 is going to punish players that are going to let their coastal lands blight. So if I let a land blight, it then blights the ocean. Oh, not adding a town. It's going to add a blight. And luckily this blight doesn't cascade. That was actually, I heard from some players that playtested Scotland way back when that it used to cascade, but there was, I believe there was a problem where some players were able to play around it and never really get the cascades, and other players that were used to lower difficulty, the cascades would just be instantly game losing for them. And the devs didn't want that to be the case. They wanted players to still kind of like have that little gap, if that makes sense. And hopefully I'm doing a good job explaining that. If not, mention it in the comments. But this used to never say, it used to cause cascades, but now it doesn't. But yeah, so defensive spirits are key for this level 5 rule. Remember, defending your coast, not only are you going to trade with the land, well, you have Dahan there, but you're gonna prevent that blight from hitting the ocean. Now, if you're playing with the ocean player, oh, and they have ocean presence in there, oh, presence dies. So This is an adversary. It's not a bad adversary for ocean, but it's dangerous because this is like the first adversary that can blight the ocean and cause you to lose presence. Now it says that you can remove the blight, and the ocean is treated as a coastal wetland, so you are able to remove the blight from that ocean. And finally, level 6, and this is after the Ravaged step, add a town to each inland land that matches the Ravaged card that is within one range of a building. And this is a massive increase to the difficulty of Scotland. I think it's about +2 overall difficulty. I mean, it shows that here, but it's very, very challenging. And let me show what that is. So let's say mountain is ravaging, and let's say it ravages like this. We defend our B2, this dies, and then because it's adjacent to this town here on B6, we have to add a town. Now this also affects empty lands. So if this land mountains is ravaging, we defend this. No ravage occurs here, but since it's still adjacent to that town on B6, it will add a town. Now it says each inland land, so this is not going to affect the coasts. It's just affecting these inland lands, and it's going to pressure the inland a lot more. And earlier I mentioned the back-to-back. Why does that matter? It matters because of the Scotland 6 rule. Because if wetlands is ravaging here, even if you trade with the land, it's going to Scotland 6 there, likely. Not always, but sometimes it will. It will Scotland 6 a town, and then it's immediately building because wetlands is building. So it's this instant add a town, build a city, and there's no window to deal with that interaction. The only way to deal with it is with like isolate effects, and that's where isolate can be fairly powerful against Scotland. Let's look at some power cards that I like against Scotland. Now these are just a couple of them. I went through the deck. I didn't pull out all of them. I just want to pick out some that really stand out. And we have Bargains of Coursing Path. I found this card to be very, very strong in this matchup just because Scotland games tend to go very long because the Fear deck is the biggest out of every adversary. It's 6 tier 1, 6 tier 2, and 4 tier 3. And since the game goes long, a card like Bargains of Coursing Paths gains a lot of value. It basically turns off 2 lands permanently. Yeah, if you have to Scotland 6, just funnel it into a big built-up land. Skips tend to be very powerful into this adversary because really Scotland doesn't pressure the players that much. The most it pressures you is like these coastal lands can come up 2 to 3 times if you're unlucky. So like it could come up in like stage 1, stage 2. It could then match in stage 3 and then come up in stage 4. So I mean, it coming up 4 times would be devastating. But like that's why skip is so powerful because now you just always have an answer for that land. Tsunami, I picked this up here. I mean, it's not the best card, but I mean, it hits the coast pretty hard, and I think this is one of the adversaries where it has more value than the other adversaries. Rumbling Earthquake, this is a Nature's Incarnate Major, and it is so strong into this matchup. It's able to hit multiple lands, and it decimates buildings, is everything you want. Because that's what Scotland does. Scotland puts a ton of buildings on the coast, on the inland, and this is like here we can hit all of these adjacent lands and just wipe out all of the buildings. I have instruments, very similar to Rumbling Earthquake, that threshold, basically making that coastal land that's a big problem. Skip the Ravage and then damage all of the adjacent invaders is very, very powerful. Blazing Renewal, Scotland tends to have very large built-up lands, like I mentioned. Blazing Renewal doesn't care how many invaders are in the land, it just does tons of damage to the entire land, wiping out plenty of buildings. And finally, Indom, it's just like a skip, like Paralyzing Fright, but it's also going to proliferate you. There's still plenty more great majors in here. I just picked out some that really stand out that I love picking up against Scotland. Let's flip up some minors. Once again, defend is king. And as I've mentioned already, because of the Scotland 3 rule, they're always going to be building on these coastal lands, if there's adjacent cities, of course. And defend just is better than control effects, usually. And picking up a card like Drift Down, this defend 4 is going to line up perfectly into the town city that pops up on B3. And this all you need now is Dahan, and then now that land will constantly clear itself. I already talked a little bit about isolates, but isolates is going to stop Scotland 3. So if you isolate the sands here, it's no longer adjacent to a city, so then it won't build. It will also stop that Scotland 6 that I mentioned. So if wetlands is ravaging here in stage 2, if I isolate this land here, it's no longer adjacent, therefore it won't Scotland 6, therefore it won't build a city and the follow-up. So isolate's very powerful into this adversary. Call to trade, this is, I call it a Scotland killer. It's also a Sweden killer. This card alone will win the game. Doesn't matter what spirit you are. If you pick this card up against Scotland, you will win the game. And that's because it's a Ravage skip. And as I mentioned, Ravage skips are so powerful into this adversary. It also gathers towns, so it can disrupt adjacent lands. So like a lot of times, like if I'm playing board B, if Mountains is ravaging Wetlands Explore, assuming there's a Dahan here in B2, but I can uh, use this ability there. I can gather the town, stopping the build here. Well, I mean, it'll still build, but it stops the city build, and then it skips a Ravage. So you get so much value for one card. And you're always gathering towns because there's always towns in either coastal land or in your inland land. So you're always getting so much value from this card, and it's a skip. You're preventing this land from blighting your coast, and then blighting the ocean. A lot of value. As I mentioned earlier, the games go very long, so cards that are support based, natures, gift of power, constancy, these cards go a long way. And finally, I have some fear cards. The decks are very large, so you got to tech fear at some point in the game. This isn't something you should prioritize right at the beginning, but in that mid game, you're going to need to get fear because this is 12 cards. Like, this is a lot of fear to get through. And then if you're playing Scotland 6, they're always building cities. So it's going to take a while to chew through Terror level 3 as well. It's not just going to instantly win because you hit Terror level 3 like some of the other adversaries. Let's reset. Let's look at some events now. Now, I picked some events that tend to be fairly negative or have unique interactions with this adversary. I'm starting off with Fortune Seekers here. It says the next Explore card matches all lands without buildings instead of the escalation symbol. This card tends to be really bad into Scotland for the players, and the reason why is it's skipping the escalation, so that person who's taking the escalation, they're happy, but that means every other player has to explore on all of their lands. So you might say, no big deal. The problem is, it does not limit the number of towns per board. So if both your wetland and your sands are empty, they get towns. They explore towns. It's going to pressure that loss condition. If you have a completely empty coast, got to explore towns because of Fortune Seekers, and that's comboed with that Scotland level 1 rule. And it will also explore the inland lands. Now that's assuming that there's no buildings already on the coast. If there's buildings already on the coast, this does nothing. But a lot of times I find this card to be pretty painful, especially for those spirits that are more control based. Urbanization, another very painful event, but it's going to affect a lot of lands, and Scotland tends to have towns everywhere. And this is going to say, in each land with at least 2 towns, replace half with cities. So if this gets hit in the mid game, you'll just have cities everywhere. And I've had this card add, I think, up to like 7 or 8 cities one time. Just, it was absurd. It was actually really funny. I mean, it didn't hurt us that badly. I think I was playing green that game. But it was just, it was funny to watch a single card add like 7 or 8 cities just on my board. And then I'm like, well, now I'm screwed. But it was a fun game. Okay, next one. No bravery without numbers. I have this card here because I've actually lost games because of it. And it says invaders do not ravage in lands unless there are more invaders than the current terror level. You might say, why does that matter? There's a weird interaction in Scotland where you may have it look like this, where Sands just explored, built. Oh, literally. Well, I just randomly put stuff down and it matches this. Sands, well, let's say it's stage 2 here. So Sands explored, built, then wetland explored. Now, a card like No Bravery could be problematic because if this Ravage is skipped for some reason and I can't kill the city, they're building a city here. And if I'm playing solo, 3 lands with cities on the coast, that means I lose the game. So there's this weird interaction. It comes up way more in solo than multiplayer, where players will lose the game because they didn't kill the city because something interacted with it in the event phase, and then they ended up building a third city. Another example is temporary truce, and this comes up more often than no bravery. It's because, as you can see, town explore or town Dahan don't fight, and now I don't have a way to kill the city here. And finally, I have thriving trade. Sometimes with Scotland, you'll make plays where you try to take out your B2 early on. There's a lot of spirits that can set up Dahan in a way to kill B2. Thriving trade says, nah, you're going to get screwed. It's going to add a city to that land. It adds that city, which is likely, that's adding +3 damage to the land, which is most likely going to exceed your defend. It's then going to add a disease, killing your Dahan. So now you lose a Dahan instantly, and then another Dahan takes 1 damage. And then you get this clever cooperation, which sometimes help. But like, if you're, let's say you had this set up here, right? And you had defense 6. Like, I just know, like, this has happened to me so many times. That's why I'm bringing this up. Um, it looks like this. Thriving trade adds the disease, killing a Dahan. And now it's blight. It's causing 2 blight because now this is going to be 9 damage versus 6 defend. 3 damage goes through, killing another Dahan and killing another Dahan, and then take 2 blight. So I go from clearing my B2 to adding a city, adding 2 blight, and losing all my Dahan. So thriving trade can be very swingy, very brutal with some sets of ravages. I mean, it's not always that you're going to get that, but for some players, if it comes up on the wrong turn, it can just be game losing. Okay, over here I have some spirits that are tanks, and just refreshing. A tank is a spirit that can take the escalations, and it doesn't really bother them. Usually the number is about 3 to 4. Once you exceed 4, even tanks may need just a little bit of support, but sometimes they can still handle it, no big deal. And really, what these spirits all have in common is they have a skip. Many Minds is skip, Vengeance is skip, Green skip, Starlight skip, or Stones left innate, which is essentially a skip. They all have skips so that they can deal with these problematic lands. I'm sure there's more tanks over here, but I just don't know. I don't have the knowledge to kind of pick and choose which ones are tanks. I know for a fact these are because I've played many games with them as a tank. I know there's a couple of Nature's Incarnate spirits that are also tanks. There's several of them actually. But yeah, so a tank can take all of the escalations for the team with minimal support and shrug it off. The last part of this video, I'm going to talk about the boards. I find most boards to be pretty solid into Scotland. Once again, board E is like the best board always, just because you can easily create that pocket, which means you can prevent those adjacent Scotland 6s, and then you can prioritize the coast. Trying to think of anything else. The worst board is definitely board D, and that's because you share a terrain type on the coast, which means if wetlands comes up, it explores 2 towns. That can be problematic because if you're playing solo, if both of these lands build, you lose the game. So board D, just very problematic. Also, the fact that your D1 stretches to all of your inland lands is just very painful because now you're going to be Scotland 6ing into all of these lands. Very similar to board H and board G, you have these coastal lands, your H2 that touches like your whole board. It's going to be impossible to stop Scotland 6s or the builds. Same thing with board G. It's actually worse on board G. You're adjacent to 3 inland lands as well as both of your coastal lands. One of the last things I want to talk about this adversary is the escalation and determining who should take the escalation in a multiplayer setting. So if I'm playing with these 6 boards, Sands Explore and Sands Build. So let me execute that. I'm just going to be focusing on the coast for the purposes of this example here. I'm not going to explore the inland. Okay. Oh, and actually, let's get rid of this wetland because that ruins the example. Okay. So, Sands Build, Jungle Explorer. Let's do the Jungle Explorer. Okay. So after your second stage one explorer, the whole team should come together and determine who is going to take the escalations. Now, yes, this is not escalations yet. We have the escalations next turn, but based on these explorers, the team should know. What do I mean by that? So if you look at board C, we have two cities. They'll be building a city here in C1. If you look at board F, they'll only have 3 buildings. Board A is going to be building a city on A3. They'll have 4. Board E is going to be building on E3. So it should look like this. And this should be 4. Now, as you can see, you might say, wait, this one has 5, and this one has 4. Why'd you mark it as 1 less? That's because I'm assuming this will be traded in the ravage. So I'm assuming ravages occur. That's dead. That's dead. That's dead. Okay. And this is how it looks. You have 3, 2, 4, 4, and 4. And you can do this before that ravage happens on the jungle. And this is where the players need to come together and decide, okay, who is taking the escalations next turn? Who should get that early support on turn 2 such that they can be prepared to deal with those escalations? A big problem that I've noticed when I play with just random players on Discord is they don't do this, and it's a big surprise on turn 3 who gets the escalations. And they're not set up properly. They get hit with 5 or 6 towns, and then their board falls to pieces. Turn 2, you should decide who's taking the escalations, and if possible, set up more towns. If you have an inland town like here on C6, because Sands came up turn 1, maybe you push that to the coast, forcing yourself to have the buildings such that you can take the escalations. And that's assuming you're a tank or just in general, if you're the player that's going to be getting all of the support. Now, spirits on the weaker end, spirits like Shroud, Shadows, Fangs. Well, Fangs is not weak, but spirits that are more tempo based, that want to create pockets, or just don't have the action economy to keep up, like Shroud. These are spirits that don't want to take the escalations because throwing towns all over their board is going to be very problematic. Because, like Shroud, you just don't have the actions to deal with this. Shadows, you have town movement, but not as much as you have explorer movement. And once towns pop down everywhere, your board is like, it's hopeless. It's a hopeless situation. So turn 2, decide who's taking the escalations and plan for that. And hopefully it's not going to be one of the control style spirits. That concludes my Scotland guide. If this video helped you, like, subscribe for more content. I will see you guys in the next video.